I'll take it a step further. You're at a baseball game, and there's 30,000 people in the stands, and a person is standing at the top of the baseball stadium preparing to jump to his death in front of 30,000 people. And the harm reduction person is standing there saying, go ahead, it's your choice, body autonomy, you do what you need to do.
Right.
And then they jump and they kill themselves in full view of 30,000 people. That is what's happening right now in San Francisco, in Denver, in LA, in Portland. It's happening in full view.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Lonely Podcast. Today, I'm going to be talking with Tom Wolf. For those of you who don't know, Tom is an advocate for policy reform on homelessness. Tom does not only have a wealth of knowledge and expertise on this issue, but also a first-hand experience. Just a few years back, Tom used to live as a homeless person on the streets of San Francisco. During our conversation, we talk about Tom's personal story, how he ended up on the streets, and how he recovered. In addition, we also touch on the current policies in place, namely the harm reduction and housing first policies. Also, we talk about the role of law enforcement and social justice reform. And lastly, we talk about the financial incentives structured around this issue. Needless to say, I'm truly grateful for Tom, not only for being willing to come and speak to me, but also for being so open and honest about his own personal story. So, I hope you will enjoy this, and without further ado, please welcome Tom Wolf.
That the leading cause of death now for kids 10 to 18 years old is drug overdose.
That is insane.
That's insane. And they have, British Columbia, most of Vancouver and a lot of British Columbia has decriminalized drug possession,
Right.
has, taken a step back on enforcement and interdiction, and has focused solely on harm reduction. They have 24 overdose prevention sites throughout British Columbia,
Yeah.
and they give out safe supply of Dilaudid to try to replace the fentanyl supply, which ends up just being diverted to the street. And into schools where you can buy those little dillies, is what they're called, for $1, for $1 a pill.
Oh,
And now OD is the leading cause of death for kids 10 to 18. It's just I
that's
can't
crazy.
I can't. And then they deflect and they don't want to take any accountability or responsibility for it. It's insane to me.
That's a very sad point, and it's maybe a good way to kind of start our discussion. So, first of all, thank you so much for doing this. Like, needless to say, this is great to have you and talking and sharing your experience. I told you that in person. I want to say it again. Your perspective is very unique, not only because you're extremely knowledgeable about this topic, but because you have a first-hand lived experience of this topic. And I guess this is kind of how I would really like to start, if you don't mind sharing. Like, how did you become the person that you are today, a strong advocate, talking about policy change, and etc.
Well, thank
Please.
you, Evie, and I appreciate the opportunity to share my story. So to just give you some background, I'm pretty much just your regular middle class guy. I'm married, father of two. My wife and I own a home here in the San Francisco Bay Area. And in early 2015, I was working for the city and county of San Francisco as a child support officer. I used to go after dads that didn't pay their child support. That was my job. And I had to have surgery on my foot because I'd gotten into an accident some years before, and I never really addressed the injury that I had to my foot, and it was time to do it. So they had to actually break my foot and reset it and insert 2 titanium screws into my foot to stabilize it. And after that surgery, they sent me home with a 30-day supply of 10 milligram oxycodone pills to manage the pain. And I didn't manage the pain as directed. Let's put it that way. I didn't take those pills as directed. So instead of taking one pill every 46 hours, I would take, it wasn't enough. So I would take two, and that would make me feel kind of loopy and help with the pain. And then one day I decided to take three pills all at once, so 30 milligrams. And for whatever reason, when at that threshold, I experienced euphoria. Uh, I got high basically. All my problems melted away. Any financial problems, marital problems, my physical pain, everything was gone for a few hours, and I loved it. I loved how it made me feel. And so I continued to use at that level, and I wanted to increase the strength. I wanted and still try to preserve however many pills I had. So I would get creative. I actually looked up on the internet how to ingest pills to be more effective, and I found out that if you crush them up and snort them, that they're a lot more effective. So I started doing that and snorting them with a straw like cocaine. Um, you could also smoke them too, which I didn't know. So I learned these different ways to ingest the pills, and instead of those pills lasting me a month, after about 10 days, I started to run low, and I started to panic because I tried to wean myself off, but as I started to wean myself off, I actually went into withdrawal, or I got dope sick basically from the pills. And I called my doctor and the pharmacy to try to get a refill, and they were like, "It's only been 10 days, man, and you don't have any refills on this anyway. Is everything okay?" And I quickly just backed away from that. And as I continued to feel more and more dope sick from those pills, instead of just trying to fight through it, I couldn't. Um, I actually went back onto the internet and I Googled up where can I buy pills on the street in San Francisco, and it took me to YouTube, which had several references to a street corner in the Tenderloin neighborhood of San Francisco called Pill Hill, Golden Gate and Leavenworth Streets. And sure enough, with my walking boot on and everything, I hopped into my family car, my minivan, and I drove down to Golden Gate and Leavenworth. And sure enough, I found five or six different people selling a variety of different pills on the street. Um, Everything from the 10 milligram oxycodones that I was purchasing to 30 milligram to 80 milligram oxycodone. And this was back in 2015 when you could actually buy these prescription pills on the street. Now you can't. Those have all been replaced with fentanyl tablets or pills that look just like the old prescription pills, but are actually counterfeit and made out of fentanyl, which has made it even more dangerous and lethal from what it was at the time when I was using them. And so I started purchasing them for $30 a pill on the street. And over the next year and a half, 2 years, my addiction progressed until when I was at the peak of my addiction, I was taking 560 milligrams of oxycodone every day just to stay well, just to function. And that was like me still going to work. Now, at this point, now I was a functioning addict, going back to returning to my job. Uh, and my performance started declining at my work, and my bank account started declining too because I was spending, at 560 milligrams a day. That was 780 milligram tablets at $30 a piece. That's $210 a day times 7 days a week.
Wow.
So I easily spent over $100,000 on pills as a result of my addiction, and actually drove myself and my family into bankruptcy. Um, I started hiding the bills from my wife. I started lying to her about whether or not bills were paid. I stopped paying the mortgage and was using all the money to buy drugs, all of those things. And then eventually, my wife found out and what was going on and cut me off from the money. And so, you know, what I will say about that is that addiction really is a ripple effect. When you yourself become afflicted with the disease of addiction, it's like dropping a pebble on a pond, and there's a ripple effect that goes through that pond. And that ripple effect affected my wife, my kids, my parents, my siblings, my friends, my community as a whole. And we're seeing that more and more and more now. When you go out and just talk to people on the street now, 1 in 4 people in America now have been touched by addiction somehow, either by themselves experiencing it or through a family member or a friend. And that number is only going to grow as this drug crisis that we're in the middle of continues to grow and get out of control. So I was out of money. I remember driving down to the Tenderloin one day and I only had $30 in my pocket. That was enough for only one pill. That wasn't going to cut it. So I walked a block down to Golden Gate and Hyde Streets, and I purchased heroin, which was being sold on the street at an eighth of a gram for $10 per eighth of a gram. They call it a dime piece or a dime. And I started purchasing heroin. And since I'm diabetic, I had hypodermic needles at home. So I actually went back onto YouTube and figured out how to shoot up, how to start using drugs intravenously. And I switched to heroin instead of stopping or getting help because my addiction was too strong at that point. I couldn't stop even if I wanted to. I needed some type of intervention, and none was really coming. Once that happened, my life really just spiraled out of control. I ended up quitting my job because I was going to work getting high. I would take my syringes and my heroin with me to work, and I would go into the bathroom on my lunch break and go into a stall, and I would mix up a shot of heroin and I'd shoot up in the bathroom, and then go back to my desk and nod out from the drugs. And everything kind of fell off the wagon at one point. Well, in that time, I quit my job. And then what ended up happening is that one night I was at home, I was in withdrawal, I had no money. My wife had a few $100s in her purse that she was, I believe, going to use for groceries. And I basically stole it in the middle of the night while she was sleeping. I grabbed her purse, took the money, took the family car, went down to the Tenderloin neighborhood in San Francisco, and I didn't go home for 11 days. I went on an 11-day bender out in the Tenderloin getting high. On the 11th day, I remember the police came knocking on my window of my van, my minivan, saying, "Hey, are you Tom Wolf?" And I said, "Yeah." And they said, "Your wife filed a missing persons report on you. You need to go home." And I had drug paraphernalia all over my car: needles, foils, straws, pipes, all that stuff. And I was filthy. 11 days out on the street. And they didn't arrest me. They just told me to go home. And so I drove home. And when I got home, my wife was waiting for me with a bag packed, saying, "I got you a bed at a treatment center. You can either go to rehab or you need to get out." And I remember, again, I was in withdrawal at that moment. And there was no way in hell I was going to go to rehab uh, under those circumstances. So I made the fateful decision to leave. And that just shows you the power of addiction. Addiction will make you choose it over your own family sometimes. And you see that all the time with alcoholics, with drug addicts, everything. They'll choose the addiction wins. And in that case, it won. And as I was leaving, my wife had me served with a restraining order, and I could no longer go back to my own home.
Wow.
So I, in effect, became homeless. And I spent the next 6 months on the streets of San Francisco in the Tenderloin neighborhood, using and doing what I needed to do to survive.
Wow. That is that is incredible. And I guess is your story something that you have encountered on the street? I mean, like the story of a family man with a steady job finding, himself in the Tenderloin. Is it something that you've seen happening? Like, I'm sure you're not the only one that happened to. So,
No, I'm not the only one, and it's more common than you think. Everyone thinks that, oh, someone who's homeless on the street is just like a bum. You hear the
right,
terms that I don't like: bum, vagrant,
right,
junkie,
right.
all of those things. And all of those things are true, but at the same time, they're all human beings. I was a human being. I am a
Yeah.
human being, and I had a family. I remember meeting a father and son combo that were out there on the street.
Wow.
They had come to San Francisco from Pennsylvania. The husband had a good job with a house with his wife and son, and he got addicted to heroin. And then his son got addicted to heroin, and they both left. And they came here, and they
Wow.
were homeless on the streets of San Francisco. I
Wow.
knew another guy. His name's John. He's now dead. God rest his soul. He died of drug overdose. He was a graphic designer in Las Vegas, and he got addicted to pills, and then that went and moved over to heroin and then fentanyl, which eventually killed him and also led him to a life on the street. So everybody that's on the street has a story. Um, I've met people that, I knew a guy that was an officer in the Navy at one point in the 1990s, and he got addicted to heroin, and he'd been homeless for years. And I think what's changing now out there on the street, and everyone should know this, is that when I was out on the street, the predominant drug of choice was still heroin, and that was in 2018. But fentanyl had already entered into the market, the illicit drug market on the street. Now, today, it's all fentanyl. you can't even purchase heroin on the street anymore in the Western United States. On the East Coast, they still have it. It's mixed with fentanyl, but out here, it's fentanyl has completely replaced heroin. You can't even purchase it anymore. And the point is that if you were using heroin, you could actually live as someone addicted to heroin for 30 years. You could survive on heroin because it's a little bit of a, you hear the term, they call it a softer high than fentanyl. But with fentanyl, it's so strong, so lethal, and it metabolizes so quickly in your body, and you have to use it every 2 hours, et cetera, once you're addicted. People don't last that long. Right now, I'm seeing people die after about 2 years out there on the street. And so people that used to be able to kind of survive or kind of function using heroin, even if they were homeless, they would live a long time. Those folks are gone now, and that's because they all had to switch to fentanyl. Because once the drug dealers figured out and the drug cartels figured out that, wow, we don't need to grow opium poppies anymore. We can just make this in a lab, and we can make it by the metric ton and smuggle it into the United States for cheaper. That was the end of that. That was the end of heroin here on the West Coast, and now it's all fentanyl, and it's completely changed the game.
Uh, and I guess, what was there a turning point for you? You know, living in the Tenderloin. What was the turning point? You know, in terms of
Well, when you're
figuring out you need to get out of here.
when you're out on the street, you need to hustle to survive, and that hustle means a lot of different things. So I had signed up for general relief or general assistance welfare. I was getting food stamps, which I would sell for 50 cents on the dollar to a local liquor store that would purchase it. Sometimes up in Chinatown, they would
Do you
purchase it.
mind? Sorry to cut you off, but do you mind explaining how does that work? Like, how do you get the food stamps and like, uh,
Yeah.
yeah, just go over
S-
that portion.
So if you're a single indigent male or female, so basically a single person who's homeless in San Francisco, you can go to the Human Services Agency and you can apply for help for general assistance, is what they call it. And they make that your determination of eligibility based upon whether you're homeless or not. And under the Care Not Cash program that Governor Newsom, who when he was mayor of San Francisco, implemented in 1999, if you're homeless, you only get $50 a month plus food stamps. But if you can provide an address, you could get $634 a month plus food stamps. Uh, and then they made changes to that. And that so where if you agree to volunteer 12 hours a month at some local nonprofit, you can get the full $634. I think it's $694 a month now. So,
Hmm.
and then, certain organizations would help you by saying you can use our address, you can get the full benefits, or you could just say a false address, and it takes them 3 months to verify it. So you've got money coming in already,
So
like right off the bat.
during Okay, so after you just put down an address, and during those 3 months, when they verify it, they basically provide you the money as if you have a fixed address.
That's right.
I
That's correct.
understand.
That's
Wow.
correct. So that's one way to get your hustle on. The other way is to boost and shoplift because trust me, $630 a month isn't enough to pay for your drug habit throughout the whole month. You got to understand when I was using and I was buying pills, I spent $100,000 over a couple of years. Fentanyl is a lot cheaper, so you can get by on fentanyl with a fentanyl addiction now for $60 to $100 a day, sometimes even less, depending on how much you use. And also, almost everyone on the street that's using drugs is what they call a polysubstance user, which means that they use a variety of different drugs. So I wasn't just addicted to opioids, I was also addicted to crack cocaine. I used crystal methamphetamine when it was available, powdered cocaine, benzodiazepines, and alcohol. Whatever I could get my hands on, I would use it in conjunction with my primary drug of choice, which at the time was heroin and later became fentanyl. So when that money runs out, you start looking for opportunities to make your hustle, which in my case was either boosting, shoplifting. So going to Target and shoplifting razors, disposable razors, and then going down to Market Street to UN Plaza, which is near our civic center, and sell them on the street to fences that would be standing there waiting to purchase your stolen items for pennies on the dollar. So I could steal $20 worth of razors and sell them for $5 on the street. And I do that a couple of times. I've got enough money to go buy heroin or fentanyl. Um, the other thing, which is what happened to me, is that I started holding for the drug dealers on the street. I became a mule or a decoy for the dealers on the street. And this is a very common tactic that drug dealers use. When you're out there on the street, you get to know the other people that are out on your block. And so I got to know the drug dealers because I used to be a drive up customer and buy drugs from them. And then I was actually on the street buying drugs from them. And they get to know you. And one day, one of the dealers came up to me and in Spanish, he said, "Hey, Tom, ¿quieres trabajo?" I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Here, hold this." And he handed me a gym sock that was stuffed with pre wrapped bindles of heroin, crack cocaine, and baggies of crystal meth. And he said, "Here, put this in your pocket." And then he handed me a dime of heroin as payment. And he said, "Don't move, just stay right there and just come over when I need you." And so what that was is a decoy. So that if he gets busted by the cops, he only has a little tiny bit of drugs on him, and I've got all the stash that's worth all the money. And I'm sitting there within his line of sight. And so long as I didn't pinch or try to steal it or anything like that, he would pay me. And they started using me again. And once word got out that I was trustworthy, I was holding for 6 different dealers at the same time at one point, and a lot of people were. It wasn't just me. And you have to understand, there's a lot of dealers out there. So in San Francisco right now, we estimate that there's 1,000 organized street level drug dealers operating on our streets in broad daylight at this time. And so there's a lot of people that are like me that are uh, struggling with addiction, that are homeless, and are looking for a way to maintain their addiction. And that's how I did it. And it worked out for about 3 months. The impetus for me getting off the street is I started getting busted. And I still remember the first time I got arrested. I was holding 6 of those socks filled with drugs, about 4.5 ounces of heroin altogether. And I thought, if you watch The Wire or any of those shows, I'm going to go to prison, And they booked me into county jail, and they put me in the medical pod, and I sat there for about 16 hours until the next morning, and then they came to me and said, "We're releasing you on your own recognizance with no bail. All you have to do is sign this and promise to stay 100 away from the block that you were on in a circle of 150 yards, so a stay away order." And of course, I complied, and I got released, and I went right back to the block, so already violating my stay away order. And all the dealers were like, "Where are my drugs, Tom?" And I showed them my jail ID, my wristband, as proof that I had been arrested, and they were like, "Okay, it's almost like they factor it into their overhead that this happens." And they gave me a dime of heroin as my payment for taking the fall for them. And that started me in this washing machine, where over the next 3 months, I got arrested 5 more times. So a total of 6 times within a 3-month period, either for holding drugs or for being spotted by the police in the area I'm not supposed to be. And finally, after my 6th arrest, they said, "We can't let you out anymore. You've been charged with 4 felonies and 12 misdemeanors. You need to stay in jail for a minute." And I spent the next 3 months in county jail, where I actually got clean. They gave me medically assisted treatment, buprenorphine, in jail to help me kick the withdrawals. And I got clean. There's no recovery in jail, but I did get sober. And from there, I started thinking about my situation, how I'd lost everything. I hadn't seen my kids in a year now. My life was just falling apart, had fallen apart. And I had an opportunity to go to drug treatment at the Salvation Army, and that's because they were the only ones that were free that would take me. And so I agreed to go. And so my brother, on condition of me accepting that treatment, he bailed me out of jail because at that point they set bail. And I proceeded to go to rehab, where I lived in a residential treatment program for 6 months. And that's where I found recovery.
Wow, and did you have any communication with any family members? You mentioned your brother, your wife, your kids, anything during this time period?
So once my wife served me with the restraining order, I could not have any
Ah,
communication with
right.
her. And I misspoke earlier. At that point that I got arrested, I hadn't seen my kids in 6 months. It
Okay.
wasn't for another 9 or 10 months after that before I saw them again. So I had limited communication with my dad. God bless him. One of the things he told me is that you never give up on your kids. But at the same time, for his own sanity and my mom's sanity, they had to practice separation with love. They're elderly. There's only so much that they could take that I was putting them through already. Because you have to understand, I was in my late 40s when this happened, already a grown, independently self-sufficient man, family man. I wasn't some 18-year-old kid. I was already 47, 48 years old when this happened. So my addiction came later in life. And maybe that helped with my recovery. I don't really know. Um, I do know now that when you go out to the street, you see the demographics starting to change. While predominantly people that are out there homeless are still my age, you're seeing a lot more young people out there now in their early 20s that are out there struggling with addiction and homelessness. And it's very disturbing and it's sad to see.
Yeah. Wow. Okay, well, I have millions more questions, but I really do, and I hope we can maybe, get back to some of the points that you mentioned now later on. But I do want, just because you have such a wealth of knowledge in this area, I do want to kind of touch on, the issue actually at hand, beyond the personal story. So I guess to start, maybe it might be a silly question, but for me, it is somewhat important. What is the correct term to, uh, to call people who live on the streets? Because I hear like so many different like unhoused, unsheltered, homeless, etc. And I believe that the term that we use are important because they impact the way we think and the way policy is being shaped. So,
Right.
from your
So,
perspective, what do you think is the correct term?
gosh, that's a great question. So, the terms I've heard are homeless, houseless, intentionally othered, uh, and then all the other more derogatory terms like, addict, vagrant, bum, junkie. You hear all
Mm-hmm.
those things, right?
Right.
Uh, right now, the common terminology that people use predominantly is homeless, although that in and of itself is a euphemism. It doesn't necessarily describe what exactly is happening to someone that's on the street that doesn't have anywhere to go. Um, Technically, I owned a house, right? But there was a restraining order blocking me from going there, and my family had taken a step back and was practicing separation with love with me. So, was I homeless or was I just a drug addict on the street? Either way, it's the same. It's the same result. I'm on the street.
Right.
I'm on the street in front of
Right.
everybody in full view using drugs, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot. The thing that's frustrating for me, and I don't mean to go around and around on the answer on this, but it's hard. There's no one answer to this, is that
Right.
homelessness is not a monolithic problem. There are many, many, many different causes of homelessness. Yet we continue to treat the solutions monolithically in that there's just one solution, just housing, and that's it. And there's so many other factors that have to go into that get downplayed deliberately for purposes of destigmatization instead of us being just honest about what the problem is. There is an addiction crisis amongst people living on the street right now that don't have anywhere to go, period. And
Right.
yes, we can house all of them, and that would be great. I support that, but that still doesn't solve the addiction. And now with fentanyl, which is so powerful and so lethal, it has completely changed the game to the point now that in cities like San Francisco, where we place people from the street into permanent supportive housing, of all the overdose deaths that happen every month in San Francisco, and we're sitting at about 70 a month right now, 70% of them are happening inside permanent supportive housing. That should be a big warning bell to everybody
Right.
that this is far deeper than a housing issue. So, I guess the easiest term that everyone identifies with is homeless, but that really just describes a subset of the people that are actually living out there on the street right now.
Right. And it's just important to note that something that I've read about was the fact that basically, and we'll talk about it later about housing. Basically, when you house people without treating their addiction, what happens is that you are putting them in a higher risk because when you're on the street and when you OD, there are other people around you that can call someone and paramedics can come over and save you. If you OD and you're by yourself, there's no one around you, and you can, like you said,
That's right.
and you can touch on the data on that too. But yeah, the death is extremely alarming. Like the rate of the people who die shortly after they are put into any sort of a facility is truly really alarming.
Yeah.
Um,
Fentanyl
yeah,
has completely changed the game on that, and it's something that's not being talked about enough.
right. Yeah. And I guess another question here, which is kind of a 30,000 foot view, is there a crisis, like a homeless crisis in the United States? And what would be the good metric to kind of define, okay, yes, there is a crisis? Because I was really thinking like a lot about this question and, trying to say, because there are some people who say, well, no, it's not that different than what happened and what was here in the past or in 20 years ago, 10 years ago. But I just want to, from your perspective, how would you define it? If it's indeed a crisis, how would you measure it, I guess?
So I think it's fair to say that we have a housing crisis in certain parts of the United States. Okay.
Okay.
So I think California is one of those places, which is unfortunate because we're the most populous state in the
Right.
nation, the most powerful state economically in the nation, definitely the wealthiest state in the nation, and the most progressive. Well, maybe Oregon gives us a run for our money, but we're pretty darn progressive too.
Yeah.
Yet we have 40% of the entire country's homeless population living in our state, which is shocking when you think about it,
Right.
right? All the wealth that's here. And that's in part because we don't build enough housing, and that's driven up the cost of real estate, period, and rents. And it hasn't, wages haven't kept up. There's truth in that, and I want to point that out. Is that you hear about lack of housing, wage inequity, systemic racism as causes of homelessness. Yeah, there's shreds of truth in all of those things. I don't think anybody that's reasonable would suggest that at least those things don't have a part to play in all
Right.
of this. But what they do leave out is they leave out things like that are viewed by maybe more conservatives view this is that a breakdown of the nuclear family structure, generational trauma, generational addiction. Your parents were drug addicts, so now you're a drug addict, right? The deindustrialization of America, all the steel factories closed in the Rust Belt in the 70s. That's what brought on the original opioid crisis with the overprescribing of Oxycontin to begin with, right? So we don't think about those things, and we should, and they all get lumped together. And the way I see it is that we need to do more to prevent homelessness, which means, we need to work on improving our public education system. We need to work on having a better social safety net, like universal health care is an idea that I support. I think that that's one idea that's socialist, and I'm usually very anti-socialist, but that's one idea that I think will work. Is that if we
Yeah.
actually had health coverage for everybody, everyone had access to it in this country. It may not be great, but it's better than not having anything. Um, and really investing in our public education systems, things like that, that will help systemically to prevent homelessness down the road. But the bottom line is that right now in the United States, we have 700,000 people that are experiencing homelessness, quote unquote, in the United States, right? Um,
Yeah.
and if UCLA's 2019 study is right that they did, 78 to 80% of them are struggling with some type of addiction or untreated mental illness. What are we going to do about that? That's 500,000. That's a half a million people, and they're on the street and they're struggling
Right.
with addiction or untreated mental illness. What do we do about that population right now? And I think that's the population that's creating all the stuff you see on social media, all the videos that you see posted, spikes in crime and shoplifting and
Right.
property crime, quality of life crimes. And those are the people that are also dying of drug overdose. And so I think it's really unfair that we don't place more focus on that population and commit what resources that we have available right now to try to actually step in and intervene with that population to help get them off the street and get them some help while we work on these other things that are larger around housing and improving quality of life for people so that might reduce homelessness in the long term. In the meantime, though, we still got to deal with 700,000 people that are out there on the street right now living in an RV or living in a tent on the street, and that's harming our communities. That's killing our cities on the West Coast, and it's changing the political discourse.
Yeah. I try to think about this, the question that I asked you before, like what metric would you use to kind of look into a homelessness crisis and call it a crisis? And I think one of the things that I immediately look into is the fact that if you compare, for example, the city of San Francisco or the city of Denver to what was the situation in those cities 10 years ago in terms of the population of chronically homeless people or homeless people in general, and also the budget that was allocated to deal with that issue. Basically what you see is that the budget was at least doubled, sometimes jump tenfold, and the situation not only did not change really, it either became stagnant or actually became worse. So that, to me, it just seems like, okay, so to me this feels like a crisis, because I'm saying, okay, there's a lot of money involved, a lot of investment. Obviously, a lot of people recognize this is an issue. However, there's no, whatever it is that was done is not actually, doesn't really show to work.
Right. And it's not just a funding issue.
Right.
It's also been a change in politics in our view of how to address the homeless crisis. And it's tied into drug policy. And it's also very, very much tied into criminal justice reform. I want to
Right.
make that clear. In California, let me back up and just say this. So, look, Denver has 5,000 homeless people, right?
Right.
San Francisco has somewhere between 8 and 20,000. We don't really know for
Right.
sure, right? The difference between the two cities is that Denver actually has shelter capacity for 100% of its homeless population, whereas San Francisco only has shelter capacity for about 40% of its homeless population. Yet Denver, because of politics and policy, does not compel anyone to use shelter, i.e., they do not have a right to shelter ordinance like New York City does. And
Mm-hmm.
so therefore they allow people to camp on the street openly, even though there's empty shelter beds sitting there waiting for them, right? This is where you have to really look at this carefully. So now the new administration in Denver is preparing to spend millions of dollars on trying to do the right thing, and I respect that, right? By having micro communities, building safe sleeping sites and tiny homes for people, but that will still be voluntary for them to go to. They don't have to go. And I'm
Yeah.
just like, why are you actually making a duplicative effort when we already have shelter beds available, and spending $100 million or hundreds of millions of dollars on tiny homes and safe sleeping sites, etc., when all you have to do is make a decision, a political decision that requires some political will, to say we're going to have a right to shelter ordinance, much like the city of San Diego is doing in California, where their slogan is now, if you have a place to go, you can't say no, and actually compel people to go to shelter instead of living on the street. Everybody wins if we do that. The
Yeah.
business community wins. Residents that live in Denver win. People walking to school, they win. The homeless win because they're inside, right? And I know they say, well, shelters suck and they're not good and everything. Yeah, but you know what? I slept in a homeless shelter. I've slept in a jail, and I slept in a street on the street, like hardcore on a piece of cardboard in a doorway on the street. And shelters are better. Period. They're not great, but they're better. And that's a place where you can also access services. So it's just maddening to me that they want to do everything except accountability, right? And that's a direct result of criminal justice reform in the efforts to decriminalize quality of life type of crimes.
Yeah.
This is part of that, and this is all under the umbrella of harm reduction, and that's where that radical interpretation of harm reduction comes in and actually does more harm instead of less. Because leaving someone out on the street to use and to also be exposed to all the trauma of being on the street is actually far more harmful than having them go to a shelter.
So can you? I think it's a very good segue. Can you talk on what is harm reduction, basically? And I think it's kind of a, actually the way I look at it, it's a philosophical, thinking. harm reduction. And maybe you can touch on that, and what is the objective of the people who talk about harm reduction, basically,
So
from your understanding. Yeah.
harm reduction has like a million different definitions, right? So if you just want to go to like the government's website and you look up what harm reduction is on SAMHSA, they'll say harm reduction is a practical and transformative approach that incorporates community-driven public health strategies, including prevention, risk reduction, and health promotion to empower people who use drugs and their families with the choice to live healthy, self-directed, and purpose-filled lives. The problem with that is that you cannot live a healthy and purpose-filled life if you're high on fentanyl. It just
Right.
doesn't, that doesn't exist. It just doesn't exist. So
Yeah.
I'm not 100% sure what they think is going to be uh, what their definition of a purposeful, self-fulfilled life is when you're actually using fentanyl every 2 hours and living in a tent on the street. So you have to think of
Yeah.
it like that, right? So the idea is to reduce harm, not eliminate it, and to also keep you alive long enough in the hopes that you find the miracle of recovery. That was the original intent of harm reduction. But there's now alternative definitions and alternative interpretations of harm reduction that include uh, just supporting drug users indefinitely, no matter what, because we know you don't want to get clean. I had a CEO of the largest addiction treatment provider in San Francisco tell me, and I'll quote her. I memorized the quote. I couldn't believe it. She told me, she said, there are 17 million people struggling with addiction in the United States. None of them want to get clean, so we should just support them. And that person's been clean and sober and enjoys sobriety for the last 30 years. And she told me that. And that was really, really frustrating for me to hear because that to me is a radical interpretation of harm reduction. That's not even harm reduction anymore. You're just like supporting someone's drug use and you're basically working towards legalizing drugs. And if
Yeah.
that's the road we go down in this country, then so be it. But get ready. If you legalized fentanyl today and made it available over the counter or at a pain clinic, and if you guys remember, for people that were around in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s, if you remember pain clinics, pill mills, you used to be able to walk into a pain clinic and a doctor would write you a script and you could walk out with like 180 80 milligram Oxycontin tablets. And 20 million people got addicted to Oxycontin that way. 20 million. And now we're sitting at 17 to 20 million in the United States right now. And if you legalized fentanyl now, first of all, two things would happen. One, you'd have millions more people get addicted because now it's legal and they're like, why not? I'll try it. And now once you're hooked, you can't function. You can't function on.
Yeah.
Um, and two, do you really think that the cartel, the Sinaloa cartel, is going to take their ball and go home? Are they just going to say, "Oh, well, you legalized fentanyl, so you know what? We're just going to pivot and sell avocados instead. We're done." Or are they
Yeah.
going to come up with one of the other 24 derivatives of illicit fentanyl that are even stronger and market that for even cheaper? So you really
Yeah.
have to think this through, and people don't think it through because they're stuck in this whole ideology that this body autonomy thing, that whatever you choose to put in your body is your own business, which I but when you're out on the street, living in a tent, stealing to support your addiction, pooping on the street, and having a psychotic break on the street in full view of everyone, and when kids have to walk through that to go to school, that is no longer. Now that person is violating someone else's civil liberties. Let's put it that way, and they need to be held accountable for that.
I thought about it and I had an analogy that I want to, ask you about. So I lived in San Francisco as well, and I'm sure you love the Golden Gate Bridge. Beautiful place, but also notorious for a destination for people to commit suicide from.
Correct.
Right. And there are about 1,800, people that committed suicide jumping from the Golden Gate Bridge. Of these, you have a few dozen, like 30 something, maybe a bit more, people that actually survive the fall. And every single one of them says, the second I left the rail, I regretted it.
Mm-hmm.
So it is, to me, analogous to the harm reduction policy. Basically, instead of Like basically saying to the person standing on the edge, oh, go ahead, jump. I'm not going to stop you. It's not my place to intervene with whatever it is that you're doing with your life. It's your choice. And if this is your choice, you can do it. And it's
So,
kind of a, it's kind of a moral question here. Is it truly something that we want to support? Allowing people facilitate their addiction that does not lead anyone to a good place.
I'll take it a step further. You're at a baseball game and there's 30,000 people in the stands, and a person is standing at the top of the baseball stadium preparing to jump to his death in front of 30,000 people. And the harm reduction person is standing there saying, go ahead, it's your choice, body autonomy, you do what you need to do.
Right.
And then they jump and they kill themselves in full view of 30,000 people. That is what's happening right now in San Francisco, in Denver, in LA, in Portland. It's happening in full view. And so the harm reduction folks are like, well, then we should open a safe injection site because we can bring that use inside. The problem is that it doesn't. It brings the use, it concentrates the use in front of those sites, and some people can go inside and use, but not everybody goes inside to use. And then pretty soon you have drug dealers showing up outside those sites. And the thing is that I'm actually neutral about safe injection sites. They can exist as part of a full continuum of care that includes treatment on demand, detox, treatment, aftercare, transitional housing, and then you could stick safe injection sites in there somewhere. But if you just open up a safe injection site like they wanted to do in Colorado, in Denver, or in San Francisco, without those other services in place, you're then opening that site in a vacuum. And what happens? It becomes a magnet for all the users. It becomes a magnet for the dealers who will post up across the street to sell you their fentanyl. And it just takes that community and turns it into shit. I don't know how else to say it. It does. So I apologize for using profanity, but that's the truth.
That's okay.
It ruins the community because there's no other resources after that. And there's no discussion about treatment. If you talk to people like Sam Rivera that run On Point in New York City, which is their two safe injection sites that they have operating in New York City against federal law, for whatever that's worth, he'll tell you they never mention the word recovery or treatment inside their facility unless the person that's using brings it up. That's not their goal. And that's the whole thing that I have is that, remember, originally the definition of harm reduction was to keep someone alive long enough in the hopes that they find the miracle of recovery. That is no longer the case, and that's where I have beef, where there's a diversion between my beliefs and what I see happening. And it's no longer about finding that miracle of recovery. Recovery is just a bonus, but it's definitely not promoted. And that's the problem, is that we're not giving people hope. When you're already out on the street, not only have you lost your agency in most cases, but you've lost hope and you've definitely lost purpose. And human beings require purpose. They do. I know, because I had purpose at one point in my life and then I lost my purpose and I ended up homeless on the street, addicted to drugs. And now in recovery, what keeps me in recovery is that I have found purpose again. And that's what we need to strive for people. So that means treatment. That means helping them address their trauma that led them to self-medicate in the first place. That means job training and workforce development to teach someone a skill or a trade so that they can go out in the workforce and be productive for themselves, not for someone else, but for themselves. And it also means housing so that they have a place to come home to that they can call their own and take some pride in. Those are all good things. Why wouldn't we want all those things? But we want to cut out two of those things and just cut to housing and think that someone who's been homeless for 10 years, sleeping in a tent, that's severely addicted to meth and fentanyl is going to be able to just come into that housing. First of all, prepare all the paperwork to sign a lease to come into that housing, and then come into that housing and be able to function. My first job out of rehab was as a case manager in permanent supportive housing in San Francisco. So I used to work with the chronically homeless. I actually was working in a building that was 2 blocks away from where I was homeless. And I remember this guy came in who had been experiencing homelessness for 10 years. Really nice guy. Didn't even have a drug issue, really. He just drank, but he wasn't shooting heroin or smoking fentanyl or anything. And I remember the first month that he lived in his apartment, he slept on the floor because he couldn't sleep on a bed because it's been 10 years since he slept on a bed. That's how disassociated a lot of people are when they're coming off the street, and we don't understand that. And they require much deeper outreach and services than just giving them a house over their head. And the irony is that after a few months of living there, he ended up dying anyway of other issues. So I guess the housing first people are like, well, he died with dignity because he was housed. Yeah, um, I guess you could make that argument, but at the same time, if we had maybe been able to reach him earlier with some type of targeted intervention on the street after maybe 5 years of living on the street, he wouldn't have died.
Yeah.
So I just feel like that there's a certain degree of we have to start thinking about drawing a line. And I say it this way: there's a subset of people on the street that require intervention. They just do. And I was one of those people that required that intervention. So, and the intervention doesn't have to mean the cops. There's lots of other ways that you can intervene, or you can intervene with a combination of social workers and the police working together, which is what I would like to see, which is what they do in Europe. It works in Amsterdam, it works in Zurich, it works in Portugal, in Lisbon, um, where we have this partnership between public health and the police. But here in this country right now, it's still very much apart. There's still a lot of division between public health approaches and law enforcement here.
Yeah, I wanted to go back a little bit and talk just briefly on how most of the people look at this problem and look at the solution to the problem. So, if you Google, and I just did it this weekend, if you Google what is the cause for homelessness, I went through the first 15 results that I've seen. Literally, almost all of them mention the top one and two reasons for like affordable housing. Number one, and the second one is usually loss of income or unemployment.
Right.
And you and I talked about it, but this is like what we call, in the legal setting, it's the proximate cause. You There's a famous example. I don't want to take too much of the time here, but it's a famous bar question. A woman takes the bus and needs to be dropped off at point A, but for some reason the bus driver drops off at point B, and point B is next to a neighborhood where there's a high crime rate. She gets off the bus, it's nighttime, she gets robbed. Now the woman is hurt. Why was she hurt? Because she got robbed. But that is the proximate cause. What is the but for cause? But for the driver dropping her off in her original point, she wouldn't have been hurt. So I guess are we asking? Are we identifying the problem correctly? Are we asking what is the but for cause here?
That's a great question. And I think so. The answer goes back to what I was saying about homelessness not being a monolithic problem, yet being treated as one, as it's just this one big block. Um, there are people that have become homeless because they lost their housing for income reasons. I lost my job during COVID, I couldn't maintain my housing, I ended up homeless. Not saying there's not, there is. And those people should be prioritized for help, to be quite frank.
Right.
Um, but we get a lot of this data that we use, that organizations like the UCSF, Benioff homelessness Department of Home Division of Homelessness did a huge national report on homelessness that is being heralded as this big, wonderful piece of data that we can use to identify that housing is really just the main issue here of homelessness, and addiction really isn't. And and so what I will say is that the majority of data that they gather from things called a point in time report, where they go out and they count the homeless once a year that are on the street. And they ask the homeless, a volunteer will come up with a clipboard with a series of questions to ask. What was the primary cause of your homelessness? And, most people will say, well, job loss. I lost loss of income. But then they're not allowed to ask, what were the circumstances that led up to your job loss? Was it just that you walked into work one day and you got a pink slip? Or was it because you were already a fentanyl addict and you stopped coming to work because you were getting high all the time? Because that's how I lost my job. I was shooting dope. And that's how I lost my $80,000 a year job. Okay. So we're not allowed to ask that question because that's violating their civil liberties if we do. How did you lose your housing? Oh, well, I couldn't pay the rent. I couldn't afford to pay the rent anymore. How come you couldn't afford to pay the rent? Well, I lost my job. How did you lose your job? Oh, you can't ask that question. But if we ask that question, the answers, the data would come back very, very, very differently. And homeless activists and harm reduction folks get really angry with me when I say that. Yet they don't want to take the step of actually asking that question to find out. Let's find out then. If I'm wrong, I'll be glad to be proven wrong. But
Yeah.
let's go out and ask those questions, and we don't.
Do
We
you
don't.
do you have an idea why is it that people don't want to ask this question? Like again, why is it that the overwhelming majority of organizations, journalists, like articles that I read and stuff like that, they all mention, like, or not all of them, but a lot of them mention affordable housing as a solution for homelessness, and they don't touch on that point. I know it's kind of a
Yeah.
vague question, but
No, it's a great question.
why do you think it is that people don't want to talk about it?
So there's two main reasons, well, like three main reasons behind that. Let me see if I can break them down quickly. So number one is destigmatization, right? They want to destigmatize the fact that people use drugs, which is a harm reduction measure, because they feel that people that are stigmatized, it actually makes it harder for that person to reach out and ask for help. So they downplay the whole issue of addiction and drugs in the homeless issue and in homeless policy on purpose because of that. That's already number one. Number two is ideology, which is that no matter what you tell them, no matter what evidence I show you, they're always going to just default back to it's a housing crisis. And then you have to start asking, why is it a housing? Why do you keep saying that? Why do you keep saying that? Well, then you have to start looking at your local and state budgets and policies and federal budgets and policies and find out where all the money for homeless services and housing goes to. It all goes to housing first programs, all of it. So there's definitely a desire to gravitate towards where the funds are. And if you want to access those hundreds of millions and billions of dollars of funding for housing for your local municipality or state, all you have to do is get down on one knee and capitulate to the housing first mantra of low barrier, drugs are allowed housing for people. And they call it supportive housing with wraparound services. Well, I think I just posted a thing on Twitter on X today that's a myth. I know I worked in permanent supportive housing and case management. Wraparound services is a myth, right? The people that were veterans that were there in a program in the housing I worked at did a lot better because they had program requirements. And in California, we've written those program requirements out of the law. We changed our welfare and institutions code in 2016 to state that basically any funding for supportive housing has to be under the housing first model. So that means funding for sober homes, for recovery-based transitional housing, for rescue missions, all of that got stopped because you used to be able to access them through block grants. And I think something very similar has happened in Colorado. So all the money is just geared towards this one monolithic solution that it's just housing first. And then they pour all the money into it, and then the housing doesn't come. Now they're talking about buying hotels and motels that are old and dilapidated and building tiny homes and building safe tent encampments and RV parks with hookups. None of that is permanent supportive housing. I'm sorry, none of it is. So they tout that they're going to build all the supportive housing. The state of California has put $12 billion into permanent supportive housing. I don't know how much Colorado's put in, but at least a couple of billion. And where's the housing? How come we're still waiting? You know, LA, Los Angeles County passed a proposition in 2016 called Prop HHH. And it was a $1 billion bond fund that was going to guarantee that 10,000 units of permanent supportive housing gets built in Los Angeles in 5 years. So the 5 years came and went in 2021. They had built 996 units of housing, and the money was gone. So that $1 billion got 900 units, not 10,000 like they said. So there should be questions about that, like investigations and audits into where the money goes and why do politicians keep saying they're going to end homelessness in 4 years and it never happens? Well, maybe if we took a step back and thought about the policies that we have in place, that maybe we're investing some of that money in the wrong place. And if we not got rid of, but spread some of that money around into other programs that promote recovery and sobriety and workforce development and things of that nature, to help people relearn and find that purpose again, we could actually make a real difference in homelessness.
Yeah. If you look into this issue, it's very hard to not see what you're describing. And as you said, then we can, those numbers are out in the open. You can look into the numbers and how many billions were spent in a lot of major cities in the United States to try and, solve this issue. And I don't, from what I've seen, I didn't see a lot of great success stories there.
Exactly.
Yeah, so okay, just to recap just a little bit, I would say we touched on the issue, on the main issue here of why do we have this, why this crisis came, how the crisis came about, and why is it that that this issue is not going away. At least it doesn't look like it right now, based on the policy that we put in place. We talked about the harm reduction. We talked about a little bit about law enforcement, financial incentives. I guess that now I would like to ask you, how do we get out of this situation? How do we, what are the policies? And you touched on it a little bit, but like if you can not just talk about the policies themselves, but also provide like an example of places that actually implemented those policies, how they did that, and how did it work? Yeah.
Right. So, in places like Amsterdam, and it's different. It's like comparing apples to oranges, really, almost when you talk about Europe versus the United States, because they just have more social programs. They're socialist. It's different. They have this balance of an open economy and socialism that kind of seem to work a little bit better. Uh, so look, if you want things to work, there has to be some wholesale changes. Number one, we have to take a step back on criminal justice reform. I hate to say it, it sounds Republican. I'm not a Republican, I'm a Democrat, but look, we're going too far too fast. We have to start holding people that commit quality of life crimes accountable again. Because for anybody that's in recovery from addiction that's listening and that's going to listen to this podcast, that accountability is a cornerstone of recovery. And we have systematically removed accountability from the system, which is why you see the flash mobs inside the stores, why you see 25,000 car break-ins on the streets of San Francisco every year, and why you see people just walking into Walgreens, stuffing their backpack that are struggling with addiction, walking out to go sell it for drugs. It's why you see all of those things happening. So we need to take a step back and relook at those things. And if you're in Colorado and you're thinking about decriminalizing some of those quality of life crimes, you should really think again. Because none of those things will work without the appropriate infrastructure to support those changes. And we have not made one iota of infrastructure to support any of those criminal justice changes. So that is one big issue that we need to address. The other issue is that we need to find a balance between harm reduction and recovery. There's like two camps that duke this out all the time in the drug policy world. The people that are pro harm reduction, pro legalization, and then there's people that are pro recovery, that support abstinence based treatment, and they can't seem to find common ground. And I know sometimes I'm one of those guys. I fight with them too. But I think we do eventually need to all sit down and find some common ground, and concessions will need to be made. I support medically assisted treatment, which is a harm reduction thing. Consumption sites can be part of a continuum of care. But then the harm reduction people need to take a step back and say, yeah, okay, accountability is going to have to be part of the equation for some people. Not everybody, but for some people. And they're going to have to be okay with that. And I don't think that they're ever really going to be okay with that. But I would like for us to strive for that goal of mutual cooperation to get this done. There's going to have to be some changes funding wise and in the law around what constitutes supportive housing in the United States. Even from all the way at HUD, I was in Washington, D.C. earlier this year, and I met with the deputy director of HUD. And they're talking about interim housing as their solution. And I asked what that is, and they said buying up old hotels and motels and converting them into housing. So you're going to stick somebody into a 180 square foot motel room without a kitchen, and you're going to wash your hands and say that's supportive housing? That's bullshit. That's not. And we're not going to see the results or the outcomes that you want to see. And the irony to that is that, again, they look the other way on the drugs. So if you're a fentanyl addict, you just isolated yourself in a 180 square foot room with your drugs by yourself. That is a death sentence. There's a reason why 5% of all the people that were homeless that got placed in shelter in place hotels during the pandemic in San Francisco, 5% died of drug overdose. There's a reason, because we isolated them alone in their rooms with their addiction and their drugs. And that's not an acceptable trade off when you consider that almost nobody died of COVID in those same hotels during that time. So you really have to take a step back and think about our policies and where the money's coming from and how we can change those policies in a way that's not gutting one to support the other. I think there's enough money for everything to exist. So we need to think about, start using terms like enlarging the solution space, right? That would be acceptable. You want to have housing first? Knock yourself out. You want to build more affordable housing? I support that. You have my full unequivocal support. But how about we take 10% of that $13 billion and we use it to build therapeutic communities throughout California and throughout Colorado? How about we actually create job training programs to give people that are ready, these young bucks that are 25 that are out there on the street, give them an opportunity to learn a trade or a skill while they work on their recovery so they can re-enter society in a productive way instead of just dropping off the grid like they're doing now. Like those are the kinds of things we have to and we have to hold people accountable. If you go out and you shoplift a bunch of stuff from Walgreens or you break into someone's car because you're a drug addict, you need to get arrested for that and probably referred to drug court where you'll get mandated into treatment. And does that work for everybody? No, but we need to send a message and create that deterrent. And so long as we continue to remove those deterrents through criminal justice, through well-intentioned criminal justice reform that has been implemented poorly without infrastructure, you're going to continue to see this problem grow and grow and grow. And then we have to do something about the illicit fentanyl coming across the border. I'm not saying build a wall, because most of the fentanyl that comes into this country comes through legal ports of entry. It's getting smuggled on like vegetable trucks and stuff like that.
Okay.
So we need to look at ways to interdict. And if that means we need to go down and deal with the cartel, maybe we do. Try to get Mexico's cooperation somehow, maybe we do. Um, but we need to do something, because right now the drugs are coming unabated into the United States and into Canada. And last year we lost 109,000 people to drug overdose in the United States, whereas 10 years ago it was 17,000. So it's gone up by more than a factor of 10, or by a factor of 10 in that time. And I don't think anybody's okay with that.
Yeah. Do you have examples? Are there cities in the US that actually implemented good policies there? What I guess you would describe as good policy, something that is, not entirely focused on housing first or something like that. Something that, because I heard one of your previous interviews, and you said that even if you want, like voluntarily, go and, get clean, if you when you live on the streets, it's very hard to do so. It's very hard to find, like, you have those safe injection sites and everything, but it's very hard for you to find like some sort of a rehab center that will take you.
Right.
So I would say two questions. The first one is, are there any good examples of cities that truly implemented policy changes that worked? And second, is there a path out of addiction, like a lot of people actually say there is, but is there actually one that you know about?
So, as far as a city that's done a good job, there's really no city in the Western United States that's West Colorado West that's done a great job of managing this crisis. And they all have the same thing in common. They all practice the same type of policies around decriminalization and harm reduction and housing first. I'm sorry to say that, but it's not those plans might look good on paper and they might work if they're implemented to perfection. And I've said that about housing first. If it's implemented to perfection, it can work, but it's not being implemented well. And that's part of the reason why things aren't working the way that they had intended them to work. And so that requires us to either to make some adjustments to what we're doing, or create new avenues for other programs to take off that can go alongside this, that will help enhance some of those services that are already out there. As far as so in the United States, I don't know. I've heard that Miami's done a few things around homelessness. They've kept their homeless numbers low. And I know that accountability is a big part of their response. I'm not saying that that's the most humane thing to do, but they understand the need to also protect their businesses too, which generates the tax revenue, which gives them the money to provide the services for the homeless in the first place. New York City, with their right to shelter, they're talking about getting rid of it. I don't think they should. I think that would be a terrible mistake. You would see 80,000 people camped out on the street in New York City if you do at night. That would be a huge blow to New York City. So, is there really anywhere in the United States that's doing a great job of this? No, there really isn't. I'd like to say in small pockets, smaller towns, there are. Um, but I don't really see anything. Now, in San Francisco specifically, we've kind of had an awakening the last couple of years here. San Francisco has kind of led the way always kind of in our radical politics a little bit. We're bluer than most blue here. We have a strong democratic socialist presence here in San Francisco, and we were one of the first cities to embrace decriminalization and harm reduction. And 2 years ago, we recalled our district attorney, who was elected as one of maybe the most progressive DA, the most reformist DA in all of American history. And in the 2 years that he was district attorney, crime exploded in this town. And he would let go of repeat offenders that had committed horrible crimes that went on to commit more horrible crimes after they'd been released. And we'd had enough. And we recalled him. And that was the beginning of this movement. At the same time, there's been a movement towards recovery that started with my advocacy, and there's other people here in San Francisco that have been advocating that also have lived experience with addiction, and some of them also with homelessness and with prison and all those things, that are standing up saying that accountability is a cornerstone of recovery, and have been advocating for more recovery options for people, to give people a choice where they can go and find recovery and make it easy for people to access treatment. So I'm happy to say that I've been consulting with the Salvation Army for the last year here in San Francisco, on a new program that they have. It's called the Way Out Initiative. Their goal is to bring treatment on demand to San Francisco, along with a program that if you can complete inpatient residential treatment, you'll get 18 months, up to 18 months of transitional housing included. Um, it's been implemented. We started to implement it already, so we can honestly say that we're offering real treatment on demand. If you're ready to go to treatment, all you have to do is pick up a phone and call, or show up to their Harbor Light Center and ring the doorbell, and you can begin the process that day, so that by the end of that day, you'll be in a detox bed. And that's something that was unheard of in San Francisco, relatively unheard of until just a couple of months ago when we started pushing this program out. And over time, we hope to grow it to where it's 1,000 beds in San Francisco. That's real recovery, where someone's ready, they can call a number and go get help that day. Because right now, the way it is that if you want to go to treatment right now today, you have to walk into the Department of Public Health drop-in center, and you have to say, I want to go to detox now. You have to have an ID first. If you don't have an ID, they can't help you. You have to go get it. So if you're homeless, you probably don't have an ID. You can't access treatment. Just right off top, right there, boom, you're out until you can get your ID and come back with it. And then let's say you're from Colorado and you're in San Francisco and you don't have your ID. How do you get your ID here? Well, you have to get your birth certificate from Colorado. Well, another nonprofit that you can go to can help you with that. And all this time, you're smoking fentanyl along the way while you're trying to navigate that process. And then after that, okay, we can take you in now to treatment. We just need to sign you up for Medicare first so you can pay for it. And then they have to go through the paperwork and apply for Medicare and wait for it to get approved by Medicare, which is another few days. Then they have to assess you to see what type of treatment would be best for you. And that takes another few days. And then, oh, wait, a treatment bed won't be open until next Wednesday. So come back next Wednesday and we'll get you all set. In the meantime, you go back to your tent and you're playing Russian roulette with your life every single day. Salvation Army program bypasses all that. They don't do Medicare, anything like that. You don't have an ID, it doesn't matter. They'll take you in, get you into the bed, and then we'll process all the stuff afterwards, like they used to do it in the 1990s and how they should be doing it now. And so those are the barriers that nobody knows that people experience to access treatment. I know that Denver has a much better system than San Francisco of accessing treatment. I visited a couple of places where you can do a one-stop shop and get treatment that day, and I think that that's beautiful. And I wish there'd be, that would get promoted more in Denver, especially to people that are out there on the street. But the big concern I have, and I'll just kind of bring it back to this, is that In Denver and in San Francisco, you'll see harm reduction people pulling around little carts, passing out drug kits to people on the street, or hygiene kits is what they call them. And hygiene kits are baby wipes, condoms, but they're also a clean needle, a tourniquet, a cooker to cook your fentanyl or meth in, sometimes a pipe, a bubble pipe, a meth pipe, or a crack pipe with a screen, and a push rod for your crack pipe. And they'll give that all to you and say, here you go. And then the concern is that if I'm that person on the street and they hand me the drug kit and I say to them, hey, you know what? I think I'm at the end of my rope. I'm ready to go to treatment. Can you help? They don't have any information to give you. And that must change immediately. But the problem is that that doesn't fit with their ideology around this isn't about treatment and recovery. This is about supporting drug users. And they've decided to put this in a silo instead of having everything be working together. Harm reduction folks did that. I just want to point that out. It's not like a dig, but it's true because they don't philosophically believe that the priority should be recovery and treatment. And that needs to change.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. I didn't know they provide all these materials. Um, I did see a lot of those needles, used needles on the streets, but I had no idea they provide, all those materials that you've mentioned. It's quite shocking, I have to say. Okay, going back to how we started here, with your personal experience and your personal story. I guess a question that I would have for you is, what would you recommend family members, friends of people who are experiencing something that you experience, who either live on the streets or struggle with addiction that bring them to this very low point in their life? Like, is there a room for family members or friends to help? Can they do something? And if so, what?
Sure. So there's a difference between helping someone and codependence. And you just, as a family member, it's really important to understand the difference between the two. My wife had challenges with that because I'm her husband and she loved me, and I also tried to milk that to get the drugs and all the stuff that I needed for my drug addiction. And that's all stuff I had to own in my recovery. And that damn near ended my marriage with my wife. Um, if it wasn't for the fact that one, my wife is a saint, and two, that she saw the effects that recovery had on me and how I responded and gave recovery an honest try, and how I agreed to go to counseling um, with her, that we were able to eventually, after like 2 years, we were eventually able to reconcile. And I'm back home with my wife and kids. So what I recommend to people is that take whatever resources are available to you. So if your family wants to help you, again, there's a difference between helping and enabling. So for the family member, they need to understand what that difference is. If your son is struggling with addiction, is calling you and saying, "Mom, I need $100," maybe you might want to say, "You know what? I love you, son. I'm not going to give you any money, but if you need to go to drug treatment, I'll pick you up and drop you off at detox tomorrow." And you keep telling them that over and over and over and over, and maybe they'll eventually come around. Um, but at some point, also, you have to just kind of have to have faith and hope that that person's going to find their way. Not everybody finds their way. Addiction is a deadly disease, and recovery is an imperfect science. It's not even a science. It's really like it is, but it's also kind of like a spiritual thing for a lot of people. I know myself, I had a spiritual awakening when I found recovery, but I know that's not everybody. And so recovery means different things to different people. The idea is, though, is that you're moving towards a drug-free life and that you're rebuilding the life that was destroyed by drugs. And so my family came back into my life after I was already sober for a while. And there was enough trust there. And I had to show them by demonstrating actions. My words no longer meant anything. It was all about what I was doing. I had gotten a job. I had found a place to live. I was going to lots of meetings. I was seeing a counselor still. I was doing my aftercare. I was very, very pragmatic about everything that I did, and I didn't give up hope. And then I agreed to go to a marriage family therapist, and I got reintroduced to my kids. And so it was a process. And that's the big thing that I tell people is that just as someone's addiction doesn't happen overnight, in that You don't go for being housed to being homeless in a day. I mean, you can, right? For me, it took a few years to spiral. Recovery doesn't happen in a day. You can't get everything back the next day either. It's a process. And it's a process that you work on really your whole life. So when you're in recovery, like me, you're in recovery your whole life. It's a lifestyle choice. And and then hopefully that can get shared with your family members. And then they can kind of see the benefits of recovery. And maybe, like my family, we've decided as a collective, the four of us, my wife and my two kids, to live our lives with the same principles of recovery. So all four of us live under this guise of looking at life through a lens of gratitude and having faith and understanding that, your higher power has kind of everything laid out for you, and it's up to you to walk that path. Like, those are just my interpretations of that. But again, it's different for everybody. And I think that that's healthy. And now, we're very honest with each other. Don't hide anything from my kids. They know everything that happened to me, just about. I mean, there's some few really dark things that I don't need to share, but my wife knows. I had to come clean. That's part of my recovery. I had to come clean with myself and with her. And so now I sleep good at night, man, because of that. And so does she. And the trust is back. So it can happen, but it just takes time. And the big thing is that you're not enabling somebody. Don't enable, and offer resources and help, and get yourself educated. If you're a family member or friend and you need support, go to Al-Anon meetings if that's what you need, or a Nar-Anon meeting, which is Narcotics Anonymous, but for family members or those affected by addiction. Just to be around other people that are in the same boat as you, it helps. You can find resources that way too. You'd be surprised, and just have hope.
Yeah. Wow. Well, Tom, I am out of words, I would say. Your story is such an inspiration, and I guess it's you walked a very hard path, and your family walked it alongside you. The path for recovery. It's quite remarkable, and I'm very happy, to be fortunate enough to talking to you today and having you share the story and everything. It's truly impressive and remarkable, and again, I guess I don't have too many words left.
That's
So
okay. I mean,
apologies,
I
but
think I
I
said
just
enough. Thanks for letting me
yeah.
ramble, man.
Sure. No, no, it's not ramble. It's truly inspiring. You mentioned hope, and I guess hope is extremely important. And looking at where we are right now, do you have hope? And do you want to share anything about that?
So I have a lot of hope. I try to be a hopeful guy. There's a lot of things wrong in San Francisco and in California and in Denver and a lot of places around this homeless issue. And we're just kind of at the beginning of the fentanyl crisis, so it can go a lot of different ways. And I just hope it doesn't go south even further than it already has. Um, but I always remain hopeful. And so if you're struggling with addiction, ask for help. Don't be ashamed, man. Just own it and just say, yeah, I'm an alcoholic or I'm an addict and I need help, and go get help. It will make you a better human being. It helps you. And then when you make that admission that you have a problem, you can actually deal with whatever pain that's making you self-medicate. It opens the door to that. Um, if you're out there and you're just concerned about your community and you're concerned about your neighborhood or your business, hold your leaders accountable, right? Look, Colorado's a blue state. California's a blue state. There's a lot of Democrats out there that, they've been told for the last 4 years, vote blue no matter who. Well, my advice to all of you is don't do that anymore. You have to start voting based on what each candidate that you're going to vote for, what their policies, if they align with what you feel is right, and especially around the way I put it, the way I frame it to people is that the homeless crisis, the drug crisis, and criminal justice reform have become the biggest crises of our generation now in the wake of COVID. That's what we should be thinking about. Is that how do we make our community safe? How do we get people off the street? How do we get less people addicted to drugs, right? And how can we improve the overall quality of life? Because if we keep just letting these flash mobs show up to your Macy's and loot it, and if we let Homeless people go around shoplifting from Target and then defecate and shoot dope on the street in front of your kids. Like, that's the kind of stuff that breaks down the fabric of our society. And we have an obligation as the electorate to stand up and hold our leaders accountable and say that we're no longer okay with this anymore. And I think that we can do it from a place in the center, politically. I don't think that it has to be a Republican thing or a Democrat thing, because this problem, guess what? It affects everybody: Republican, Democrat, red state, blue state. It affects us all. And so we all have an obligation to come together and find some solutions that are going to require some give and take. But one of those things that has to be given in there is accountability, because again, accountability is a cornerstone of recovery.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Well, thank you so much again. This has been really wonderful. Your advocacy is so important. What you're doing with the Salvation Army, with the recovery, it's just so important. And who better than you to advise people on that issue and help people who walk the same path you walked in. So thanks again, Tom. Thanks a million. And hope to speak to you soon.
Okay. All right, Evie. Thank you, man. My pleasure. Okay. Bye.
Thank you all for listening. To support our podcast, please subscribe and follow us on social media. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.